This Typecast Tudors series is intended to look into people from the Tudor era who are often shown in the same way again and again, and again and again, and again and again. Of all the people who are shown the same way, William Cecil being the loyal advisor, never telling Queen Elizabeth what she wants to hear, or the hectic rise and fall of Cardinal Wolsey, I can't think of anyone whose on-screen counterparts are more interchangeable than that of Jane Parker, aka Jane Boleyn, aka Lady Jane Rochford. As the wife of George Boleyn, sister-in-law of Anne Boleyn, and lady-in-waiting to all but the last of Henry VIII's wives, she saw a lot of what went on at Tudor court. More often than not, she is seen as the sister-in-law from hell. She is a shrew, a backstabber, and the ultimate mean girl. And yet, if your drama gets as far as Catherine Howard, one can sometimes see a lighter side to her, and it's Jane's seemingly maternal connection to the tragic young queen that seals her fate and gets her sent to the block as well. By the way, I'm going to be calling her Jane Parker, Jane Boleyn and Jane Rochford interchangeably. Often overlooked, because there was no shortage of women losing their heads in the Tudor era, it's finally time to give her the attention she deserves. This is Lady Jane Rochford, the J. Bruce Ismay of Tudor dramas. By the way, my voice may sound a bit different here. It's because I'm recording in a different location. I'm pet sitting for my sister's cat again. And I thought, great, this is the perfect weekend for me to both finish the script for this video and record it. There'll be a series of cars going by the window, unfortunately. But hopefully we might be visited by my sister's cat. That'd be nice. Yeah, and also this room's a bit echoey. I've tried to mask it as best I can, but we'll see how it goes. Jane Parker is believed to have been born in 1505. The Parker family, like the Boleyns, were an up-and-coming clan who had only recently come into nobility during the Wars of the Roses. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any sources that point towards their coat of arms, at least none that are concrete enough. When I make these videos, I like to put their family sigils to put in the backgrounds. However, after looking at the pictures of the altar in the Chapel St. Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London, where Jane Boleyn is now buried, I saw this shield on her memorial tile. So I recreated it as best I could. It includes the Boleyn sigil and the coat of arms of the barony of Morley. The Morley barony was created in 1299, given to William Morley under Edward I. It was held by the Morley family until 1443, when Eleanor Morley was married to Sir William Lavelle. She held the barony in her own right, while her husband was also addressed as Baron. Their son Henry inherited the title in 1476, but he died without heir, and the title passed to his sister, Alice. At the time she inherited the title, she was married to William Parker, Jane's grandfather. William was a fervent supporter of Richard III, serving on his Privy Council and being the last Plantagenet's standard-bearer in the Battle of Bosworth Field. As we know, Richard was killed at Bosworth and Parker was taken alive by the triumphant Henry VII. Parker would be imprisoned, though he managed to sire a son named Henry. He died in 1510, believed to have gone mad and suffered a mysterious violent death. Alice remarried to Edward Howard, son of the Earl of Surrey. When Alice died in 1518, Henry Parker inherited his mother's barony. Henry Parker served at the Tudor court and married Alice St. John, with whom he had 4 children, 2 Henrys, a Margaret and a Jane, who is believed to have been the youngest. With her father at the court, it was inevitable that Jane would soon be presented to serve as maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon and make a good match. She is believed to have come to court in her early teens, with her father being an intellectual doing translations of Plutarch and other Roman philosophers. Jane may well have received a rich education. Jane was present with Catherine, along with her future sisters-in-law, Mary and Anne Boleyn, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold in 1520. 2 years later, at the Chateau Vert pageant, which saw male and female courtiers, including Henry VIII himself, perform as male and female virtues, Jane was one of the participants, playing the role of Constancy, which is another word for loyalty. In 1524, around the time when Mary Boleyn became the mistress of Henry VIII, a match was arranged between Jane Parker and George Boleyn. If their supposed years of birth are correct, George would have been 20 and Jane would have been 19. The wedding was a rather lavish affair. King Henry, holding the Boleyns in high favour, gave the newlyweds Grimston Manor in Norfolk. As I said last time, the marriage between Jane and George has typically been represented as not only loveless, but dysfunctional enough for her to want him dead. Now, what evidence is there that this marriage was unhappy? I think the two biggest factors are that it was an arranged match, and that, despite over a decade of marriage, they never had any children. But also there is the speculation that George was gay, and thus neglected Jane to take male lovers. And also that Jane was so jealous of the connection he had with his sister that she felt she could never be a part of it. Despite the claims of historian Retha Warnick, there is no evidence that George was gay, or even bisexual, despite all the erroneous things put against the Boleyns over the years, from Anne's extra finger
Put it away, babe.
to birthing a deformed fetus. George's potential homosexuality was not one of them. If their lack of offspring was down to either George or Jane being impotent or infertile, then it might be that resentment grew between them. The pressure would be on George to have an heir and carry on the Boleyn line, and Jane would have seen other women at court who could have had anywhere between 4 to 10 children, with her sister-in-law Mary having had 2 children of her own, and thus become envious. And remember, this was a time before marriage counselling. Maybe a few therapy sessions could have sorted them out. Then again, there is another possibility that George and Anne diverged with Jane on matters of religion. The siblings were known to be interested in matters of religious reform, and read the works of Tyndale and Luther, even though to do so was risking charges of heresy. Jane, meanwhile, may have stayed true to her Catholic roots. If George was keeping his Protestantism secret from his wife, all the more reason for distrust and resentment to arise. But whatever the reason, regardless of what was going on between them, Jane had married into a family which was on the up and up in the 1520s. First Mary was Henry VIII's mistress, and then he turned his sights onto Anne Boleyn. Unable to get an annulment to his marriage from the Pope in order to marry Anne, Henry decided to break with the Catholic Church and make himself head of the Church of England. And Jane would be present for all of this. When Thomas Boleyn gained the earldoms of Ormond and Wiltshire in 1529, the title of Viscount Rochford was passed down to George, making Jane Viscountess. She would hold this title for the rest of her life, and would often be referred to as Lady Rochford. In 1533, Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, and she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. Not the son and heir they wanted, but at least she was healthy. Nonetheless, with Anne spending most of her tenure as queen either pregnant or recovering from a stillbirth/miscarriage, Henry began to take mistresses. Anne did not like this at all, and she acquired Jane's help in getting rid of a lady in her household whom Henry was presumably sleeping with. Having learned of this, it was Jane who received the blame, and she was banished from court. Where was George in all this? Going back and forth to France as the ambassador. Begs the question, why didn't she go with him? This may have been where she started to distance herself from the Boleyns. And then 1536 came along. Anne lost her child for the 3rd time in a row, and Henry's lustful eye had turned onto Jane Seymour. Cromwell had decided the only way to get rid of Anne was to accuse her of adultery, incest and treason, charges that no one could possibly defend. While gathering, or falsifying, his evidence, Jane, who appeared to have been back at court with Anne and George once more, was rumoured to overhear many of the testimonies brought against Anne, such as telling Henry Norris that he looked for dead men's shoes, as well as a comment about King Henry's prowess in the bedroom, or lack thereof. She is then said to have told this to Cromwell, who took it without question as proof of Anne's guilt. But who was the first person to have claimed that Jane betrayed her husband? A man named George Wyatt, who was born almost 20 years after Anne's execution. Jane was mentioned but once in the legal proceedings against George, when asked if Anne had told Henry about Henry's inability to lift his sword. George read aloud the testimony of Henry's impotence at his trial, though he was implored not to, and this only incriminated him further. He was found guilty by all judges before him, one of whom was Jane's father, Henry Parker. Wyatt claims that Jane was a wicked wife, accuser of her own husband, even to the seeking of his own blood. John Fox claimed that Jane forged evidence against George and Anne, then added, "If it be so, the judgment of God is here to be marked." This view of Jane was corroborated by Peter Heylin in 1660, and it has since become the norm to blame Jane Parker for Anne and George's downfall. George is also believed to have said, "On the evidence of only one woman, you are prepared to believe this great evil of me," but who the woman was is never specified. And yet, despite all these claims, they appear to ignore that William Kingston reports Jane sending a message to George to reassure him that she would seek Henry's mercy on his behalf. Kingston was a neutral figure in Anne Boleyn's downfall. He had no particular hatred of the people who came into the Tower. It was just his job to keep them there. He would pass on their words as per his orders. He would have no reason to falsify them. Julia Fox is one of few historians who repudiates the idea that Jane betrayed them. Jane Rochford found herself dragged into a maelstrom of intrigue, innuendo, and speculation. For when the King's Chief Minister Cromwell sent for Jane, he had already had much of what he needed, not only to bring down Anne and her circle, but to make possible the King's marriage to Jane Seymour. Faced with such relentless, incessant questions, which she had no choice but to answer, Jane would have searched her memory for every tiny incident that occurred to her. Jane had not been quick to tell tales, but she had buckled under the pressure of relentless questioning, and it was her weakness under interrogation that gave her future detractors, happy to find a scapegoat to exonerate the king from the heinous charge of callously killing his innocent wife, the ammunition to maintain that it was her evidence that had fooled Henry and destroyed Anne and George. Culpable of their downfall or not, Jane became widowed on 17th of May 1536, when George was executed on Tower Hill. Whether she was present at the execution, for it was a public affair, is unknown. However, she could not look forward to sitting back with the wealth her husband had accumulated and moving on with her life. George's estates and assets were seized by the Crown, including the dowry which Jane had brought into her marriage. She would write to Cromwell begging for her jointure to be returned to her, and it is reasonable to assume that she returned to her father's house until the end of 1536, when she returned to court to serve Jane Seymour. By 1540, when Anna von Claver arrived in England, Thomas Boleyn had died, and Jane had her full jointure and some Boleyn estates given to her by Cromwell. It may have been a source of court gossip as to why Jane never remarried, but her reputation was likely tarnished as a result of her association with the Boleyns. Just months after Henry's fourth wedding, he had his marriage annulled and took a new wife, Catherine Howard. Jane testified that Anna confided in her that she was still a virgin, much to Henry's gain and Cromwell's disgrace. In no time at all, Henry married Catherine, and Cromwell's head was spiked on London Bridge. Jane found herself serving in Catherine's household, one of a handful of women who had served all of Henry's wives up until now, including Anne Parr, Catherine Parr's younger sister. It isn't known how Jane gained the trust of Catherine Howard, or why she would act as a go-between for her and Thomas Culpeper. Ideas have floated around, such as Jane and Catherine developing a mother and daughter relationship, or one or the other being under duress. Say Anne Boleyn had told Jane that Henry was impotent. If she had said that as early as 1536, his situation is likely to have been worsened by then. Given Henry VIII's decline in health and him becoming more obese with every passing year, she would know that Catherine needed a child to gain security, and thought Thomas Culpeper was a reasonable candidate for the job, who could keep his mouth shut. On the other hand, if the rumours about him are to be believed, may have manipulated or threatened Jane into going along with his scheme to take advantage of Catherine, using her association with a disgraced house to do so. Catherine mentioned Lady Rochford in her letter to Culpeper, which was found among his possessions, and she would later testify that she would be on the other side of the door when they had their trysts. Catherine's other ladies would claim that Jane would stay longer than anyone else in the evenings and wouldn't let them enter Catherine's chambers. In late 1541, Henry received a letter in his pew regarding Catherine Howard's past, which then snowballed into a royal scandal that would see 4 people executed, Jane among them, as well as many, many people who would be imprisoned in the Tower of London. Catherine's confinement became Jane's, as the young queen was held first in her apartments at Hampton Court Palace and then at Sion Abbey, a place further up the Thames between Richmond and Hammersmith. Jane would be taken away for questioning and never return to her mistress's side. Catherine and Culpeper both accused Jane of having a wicked imagination. Wyatt, Cavendish and many others would label her a bawd who deserved her punishment, a bawd being a brothel keeper or a female pimp. Jane confessed to her actions, but insisted that she was the one being compelled. She was taken to the Tower of London. She immediately suffered a mental breakdown and was declared to have gone mad. Jane's mental agony was drawn out for several weeks before she died. While Culpeper and Francis Derham were dragged to Tyburn and beheaded/eviscerated, Jane awaited to hear the inevitable news that she was to die. Henry sent his own physician to see to Jane's mental instability, while she recuperated under Admiral Lord Russell's supervision. There was a law at the time that those deemed to be legally insane could not be convicted or executed. Henry didn't like that, and he forced through a bill in Parliament to overwrite this law in cases of treason. Some claim that her madness was feigned in order to save her own life, and this was Henry calling her bluff. Neither Jane nor Catherine had a trial. Not even a show trial as had been given to Anne and George. This was because of a new piece of legislation that had been brought in since 1536. Act of attainder used to mean that someone convicted of treason in a court of law had their estates, titles and assets seized, along with that of their families. It was basically a way of discouraging the rich people and the nobles from doing treason. Now, the act meant that they didn't even have to bother with the courts. The king and the Privy Council says what happened, and then the witnesses and the accused say what happened, and then the king just executes the accused anyway and takes all their stuff.
That's why we call it justice, because it's just us.
It meant they didn't have to do trials anymore, or if they did, they were just formalities and foregone conclusions. Jane and Catherine were both declared guilty and sentenced to die. This was a cruel and corrupt practice which thankfully was discontinued under Mary I, who had seen the practice take down many of her allies, including the Pole family. Catherine was brought to the Tower not long before her execution. On the morning of 13th of February 1542, Catherine Howard would be the first of the two women to lose her head on Tower Green. While her body was taken to the Chapel St. Peter ad Vincula, her blood still wet on the chopping block, Jane was led to the scaffold. Her execution speech is unrecorded. It is said she was clear-headed enough to ask the spectators for forgiveness before she died. Otwell Johnson describes both the executions. I see the Queen and Lady Rochford suffer within the Tower the day following, whose souls I doubt not be with God. For they made the most godly and Christian's end that ever was heard tell of, I think, since the world's creation, uttering their lively faith in the blood of Christ only, and with goodly words and steadfast countenances they desired all Christian people to take regard unto their worthy and just punishment with death for their offences, and against God heinously from their youth upward in breaking all his commandments, and also against the King's royal majesty very dangerously. Wherefore they being justly condemned, as they said, by the laws of the realm and Parliament to die, required people, I say, to take example at them, for amendment of their ungodly lives, and gladly to obey the King in all things, for whose preservation they did heartily pray, and willed all people to do so, commending their souls unto God, and earnestly calling for mercy upon him, whom I beseech to give us grace, with such faith, hope and charity at our departing out of this miserable world, to come to the fruition of his God, held in joy everlasting. Amen. However, I found a very flimsy and biased version of the speech in The Lady in the Tower by Alison Weir. It goes, "Good Christians, God has permitted me to suffer this shameful doom as punishment for having contributed to my husband's death. I falsely accused him of loving, in an incestuous manner, his sister Queen Anne Boleyn. For this I deserve to die, but I am guilty of no other crime." Jane's head came off in a single stroke, and she will be buried with Catherine Howard, as well as Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn. Whether they liked each other or not in life, they are stuck together in death.
She was as innocent as you or I.
Thanks for the compliment.
She died so that the king may be free to marry Jane Seymour. Yes, that's what they mean when they say chop and change.
Your Grace.
Do you have him?
Have I Your Grace's permission?
Bring him in, Lady Rochford.
Not another one.
Oh, it's delightful.
Yes, but you had 3 already.
Oh, it's so kind of you to get involved, Lady Rochford. I was terrified. I thought if you found out, you'd kill me.
Quite the opposite. I understand better than anybody what it is to be unhappily married. I'm keen to do everything I can to help.
Oh, thank you.
That can't have been easy for you. But put yourself in the Queen's shoes. She knows the only reason the King has asked you here is because he desires you. She's a good woman, trust me.
These on-screen depictions treat Jane with a little more kindness than others. Even when it goes by the old trope of her and George's marriage being unhappy, it all turns out to be a giant misunderstanding. The first on-screen depiction of Jane Parker was in The Private Life of Henry VIII, which does not feature George at all, even though she is referred to as Lady Rochford. She is one of the ladies hurrying to take out Anne's initials and replace them with Jane's. She and Catherine Howard share a few jibes before Henry enters for the first time. As the movie progresses, she is seen here and there in the court, especially in relation to Catherine Howard, and she is the one to send for Thomas Culpeper, so he and Catherine can meet in secret. It is never shown how the King's ministers find out about the Culpeper affair. After Catherine and Thomas have decided to go all in with their love affair, the scene fades to Jane being interrogated and threatened with the rack. Jane was played by Judy Kelly, an actress who was barely 20 years old when they filmed this. I must say that's quite impressive, as she certainly carries herself as a mature woman. Next up is this blink and you'll miss it appearance by Margaret Ward in Henry VIII and His Six Wives. This being a movie that was very much in need of a longer runtime, many characters had to be sidelined. The presence of other characters like Brian Blessed's Charles Brandon or Michael Burns' Edward Seymour, who seem to do little in the plot, are there for the viewer to piece things together in repeat viewings. The woman who brings Catherine's spaniel that she intends to give to Anna of Cleves could have been a nameless person, but labelling her as Lady Rochford at least signals where this person is at this time. Kelly Hunter took on the role in the ITV Henry VIII series. I went back and checked, and I was right. She and George never have a proper scene together. And here's something I haven't talked about yet because I didn't think to bring it up, but writing this script and looking at clips over the years has now made me realise. If you take a shot for every single time a character says well, you'll be face down in a gutter by the time Ray Winston's arse cheeks make their ITV debut. This Jane is sprinkled around scenes where the Boleyns are collectively gathered, so one can reasonably guess that this is Jane, but she doesn't have any dialogue. When Anne is upset and George comforts her, she looks on it like it's incriminating, but it's been edited so she actually has the full context of the scene, so why is she getting so offended? But this decision to have her eavesdropping will be repeated a little later on. Her next appearance comes in the second half, when Norfolk and Gardner try finding a way of returning Henry back to the Catholic side of things. Jane walks with them, again, no dialogue, and later she pretends to be a maternal figure to Catherine, but she's actually a spy for Norfolk, who reports her behaviour back to him. After Catherine and Culpeper have been found out and arrested, Norfolk attempts to warn Jane, to which she panics, likely a reference to how she has a breakdown after her arrest. But Norfolk falsely promises he will save her if she covers for him.
I'll blame it on the girl. I'll tell them you knew nothing.
One pathetic sub-story later.
I promise, Your Majesty, it was the girl and Lady Rochford. They're in league together.
Had my fingers crossed.
And that's the last we see of her. Now, I would have done a Philippa Gregory segment, but there is only one on-screen representation of her in a Gregory adaptation, and I stand by that. Apparently Zoe Waits is credited for Jane Parker in the 2003 Other Boleyn Girl, but for the life of me I can't find a single scene which addresses or acknowledges that George has a wife. There are many scenes filmed in this one room where the Boleyns and Norfolk plot and scheme together and occasionally yell at each other. Jane could have been in any of these scenes, even just standing in the corner, so we know that she exists, but no, nothing of the sort. So yeah, I count Juno Temple's Jane Parker as the only depiction told from Philippa Gregory's unusual technique. Well, technically it's Philippa Gregory. The film is a bare-bones retelling of the book, and more of an excuse for Peter Morgan to put the first half of the ITV Henry VIII series into a movie format. Jane is a lady in waiting at court when Anne and Mary arrive and are introduced to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine makes a very shy Mary sing for her, to which Anne is already plotting Catherine's downfall in her head.
When you're alone and life is making you lonely, you can always go downtown. Just listen to the music of the traffic in the city. La 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 la, and the neon lights are pretty.
Bravo.
Jane rushes to reassure Mary that Catherine is a good person, but despite how good intentioned she seems, in the next scene both George and Anne are shown disliking her. She clearly fancies him, but he calls her vile and ambitious, so it is a massive blow when his father says he must marry Jane. George neglects Jane, and is hinted at never having slept with her. As a result, she has become resentful of him. Norfolk decides to use Jane as a spy, to see if he should cut the Boleyns and run if Anne miscarries. And I suppose that's the reason for Jane to be there, as Anne and George attempt to do the incest, but she leaves to tell Norfolk before they stop, unable to go through with it. So really, it is all a big misunderstanding. Norfolk makes Jane tell Henry what he saw, and then she is never seen again. Even though there is a Where Are They Now epilogue, Jane's fate is not listed. But the one redeeming feature of this version is it invites the audience to actually feel sorry for Jane, because while she was mistaken, she wouldn't have done what she did if George had just been kind to her. At no point do we ever see her being ambitious or vile, as he described her, which is a real failure of storytelling. I didn't find out what actually happened to Jane until I saw my mother was reading The Boleyn Inheritance. The Boleyn Inheritance is pretty much the sequel to The Other Boleyn Girl, and it's much more pervy than its predecessor.
Husband?
Madam?
You wish to speak with your sister and not with your wife, I think.
I think so, yes.
And I may go hang?
As you will, madam.
If you could but see beyond her eyes, which would dazzle you, you wouldn't love her and fawn upon her as you do. You wanted love, my lord. You confound me.
I know that things have not gone well for you since your husband was executed. I have been utterly abandoned. I feel I was condemned because of what George did. Nothing was your fault. George Boleyn was his own keeper.
This category relates to the Janes whose appearances span long enough to show both her marital problems with George and her actions in Catherine Howard's rise and fall. Hello, it's Pumpkin. Pumpkin's come to say hi. Oh, she's curled up on the carpet behind me anyway. So we'll begin with what was actually the first appearance of Jane, rather than a brief, inconsequential cameo. Sheila Burrell in The Six Wives of Henry VIII. Jane appears in 3 of the 6 episodes. This one mini-series, I think, cemented the typical view that Jane and George's marriage was not only unhappy, but she hated him so much that she was the one who put it in Cromwell's mind that Anne and George were incestuous, knowing it would lead to the siblings' executions. For this series, each episode had a separate writer, so characters who were antagonistic at first may become more amicable or sympathetic in the other. Another thing to remember is that a significant chunk of episode 3 is happening during the events of episode 2, as Jane Seymour rises above and supplants Anne Boleyn. As a result, there are some scenes in the 3rd episode which precede parts of the previous, but they tend to inform one another. I've already talked at length in a previous video about the dinner scene in episode 3, which features a handful of people who seek to gain from supplanting the Boleyns, and Thomas Cromwell recruits them via a walnut analogy. Jane Parker, though married to George, is present at the dinner, and she is impressed with his idea to accuse Anne of adultery.
May I say, we have long needed your lordship.
As a result, I believe this happens before the mask, in which she sneaks off to a dark corridor to tell Cromwell of the evidence that she's gathered. She knows full well that anything put against Anne is a lie, but she's still willing to go along with it, because she hates George that much. In a sense, she likes Jane, because she's sweet and innocent. The source of her animosity is the fact that George and Anne are much closer than Jane can ever hope to be with him, and he finds her shrewish. Moving on to the Catherine Howard episode, rather than remaining a lady of the court, Jane has, since the death of Seymour, been living at Lambeth as Catherine's governess. As a result, the two have built a mother-daughter bond, where Jane provides the motherly affection which the young girl so sorely lacked in reality. Over the years, it seems that her animosity for George receded, and even says God rest him when talking about her wedding night. Still, her reputation precedes her.
Lady Rochford's husband spent the night in prayer.
Had I been Lady Rochford's husband, I would have done the same.
Jane gets directly involved in the Culpeper affair, and her final scene is when they are arrested. Her sudden scream may hint towards her inevitable mental breakdown in history, although after so many scenes of quiet talking, it can give you a bit of a jump scare. Sheila Burrell's performance was fine, and I think it may have been influenced by Sian Phillips in I, Claudius, but it did set a trend moving forward. And now the other well-known Jane Rochford, Joanne King in The Tudors. This is the only one to show her execution, but we'll come to that. She first appears just after the halfway point in the second season, around 1534 to 1535. It's a strange choice. My guess is they forgot to put her in earlier, or they just couldn't find a use for her up till now. There is no build-up to her character's introduction. George's preceding scene in the very same episode is Cromwell showing him a printing press. George, now in an established relationship with Smeaton, takes getting married with all the seriousness of a 14-year-old boy sitting at the back of the classroom making fart noises. Meanwhile, Jane, who is terrified of marrying a stranger, is frog-marched down the aisle by her father. And then there's the trigger warning scene, which I really, really hate, and I don't know why they did it. I tried to find the reason online, but I can't find anything that really justifies, or at least attempts to justify, this decision. But reason or not, it is one of the most unnecessary uses of SA in a piece of media that I've ever seen. I don't want to show what happens, so I'll quickly just sum it up. So, on the wedding night, George has gotten very drunk and he comes in, tells a nervous Jane that she's pretty and kisses her, and then things escalate quickly.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
Afterwards, George passes out and Jane is left crying and in pain. The only justification one can gather from this is that it represents women of the time in arranged marriages who would be required to be virgins and kept ignorant of what happens on the wedding night for sake of their virtue, and they would then suffer a traumatic experience because their husband was too rough. But we didn't need this to explain why Jane would betray George. You already have George in a relationship with Smeaton. You could have just had him leave Jane alone on their wedding night to be with Smeaton and just not consummated the marriage. Is it really worth making one of your LGBTQ characters a you-know-what to explain why Jane betrayed them, but have her come off as justified for doing so? The only reason she turns on Anne as well is because Anne offered no help with her marriage, but she was going through her own thing. So Jane returns in season 3 and 4 as a lady-in-waiting. Jane Seymour assures her that it wasn't her fault that George betrayed her. And finally, she is in the first half of season 4 with Catherine Howard. Jane is definitely portrayed as someone trying to gain whatever she can for herself, and her motives for helping Catherine are selfish in nature. Thomas Culpeper desires Catherine and starts sleeping with Jane so he can learn more about Catherine, but also to pretend that it's her he's sleeping with. Jane is briefly crestfallen that he's using her, but decides to arrange secret meetings between the two so she can get some of her own enjoyment. She's often seen watching them through the keyhole, as they are borrowing her room, and she's lightly getting off on watching them. During their final episode, both Catherine and Thomas put the majority of the blame onto Jane, and she sells them out in turn. Her mental deterioration is briefly touched upon, and she's shown smearing her waist on the walls. I'm not sure if she has genuinely gone mad or if she is faking it to save herself. Regardless, Henry moves the goalposts. Jane seems clear-headed enough at her execution, although it shows her dying first instead of Catherine. I can forgive this for dramatic reasons, as the episode needs to end with the death of a queen, but at least it gives Jane a send-off, when normally they would have just cut away from her in favour of Catherine already.
I'm always happy to hang on to your coattails, Dad.
Yes.
Well, someone's got to progress your career.
Just be sure Jane doesn't get any ideas into her head. She's a spiteful little bitch sometimes. Yes, my dear sister-in-law holds a loose tongue in her head, and she is fiercely protective of my brother. Your Grace. Lady Rochford, your timing is impeccable. I was just telling Miss Seymour here about your enviable conversation skills.
Did you not go to her to comfort her, she being your mistress?
No, I came looking for you. Oh, you think you can shame me out of saying what I must say? My husband, George, is always with Anne.
You want me to record that?
If you're worried you won't remember it.
And one must pity him. His friends cuckolding him, his daughter defying him, his niece contracting herself in marriage without his permission. I suppose he can do the deed with pasty Jane, can he? Anne said it was like being slobbered over by a mastiff pup.
These are the ones that decided not to poke further into what made Jane Rochford tick, and presents her as a vindictive woman who sold out her husband and her sister-in-law, even though they had a golden opportunity to play around with it. What's worse is these are the most recent portrayals. In a time when we're trying to rehabilitate the actions of women in history, who often go vilified. In Blood, Sex and Royalty, Jane is played by Sophie Bottage, or Bottage. She's from Nottingham too. I wish I knew how to pronounce her last name. Anyway, she shows up very early on in the series, her first glimpse being very brief alongside Mary at the Chateau Vert pageant. Later, while Anne is quote-unquote grounded at Hever Castle, Jane teases her about her predicament, to which Anne breaks the fourth wall.
Jane Boleyn, my brother's wife. Typical sister-in-law.
Which immediately tells you what we can expect from this depiction of Jane. However, she and George appear to be getting along at this stage. She teases him a little, but he smiles in return. They appear to be having an amicable conversation behind Anne at the joust. It isn't until the end of episode 1 that there's any change in her, when she sees George with Anne. I don't have a brother, so I don't know if this is appropriate conduct. So episode 2 comes along. Jane once again finds Anne and George being friendly, but they are hiding their Protestant leanings from her. Clearly George doesn't trust her to keep a secret, and even turns down her offer to celebrate his promotion. Jane turns this envy onto Anne, and then her nonchalance at the Anne Sans Tête drawing makes me think it was her who did it. But still, she revels in Anne's triumph, but by the time the third episode comes along, it's pretty much no question that Jane despises Anne, and she's within earshot when Henry Norris and Anne make that dead man's shoes exchange, hinting that she is the one to tell this to Cromwell. But much like what you'll see in the following property, both Lady Somerset and Jane are the ones to testify against Anne.
You remain here.
So what? I'm grounded.
Maybe the next time you decide to pit streaming services against each other and cause a drought, you'll think twice.
It was not my fault streaming services pay people more than was sustainable in any business model.
And yeah, the 2021 Anne Boleyn miniseries doesn't do much to rehabilitate Jane's image either. It's rich that a series so hell-bent on telling the truth about Anne Boleyn, being so arrogant to claim that this was based on a true story and on lies, they don't care about the representation of any other character besides Anne Boleyn, and even then her image has been warped to the extreme. Here she is played by Anna Brewster. She's at least enjoying the assignment of playing a gossipy bitch on the same level as an HOA Karen with no hobby, but she is like a sundae with only vanilla ice cream and no toppings. Basically, she's only serving one flavour and brings nothing that we haven't seen before. They even go one further with this lunacy in the final episode, where they bring both Jane and Lady Worcester into the courtroom to openly betray Anne. This was either a decision to tell in shorthand that these two betrayed Anne, or the whole based on lies angle was the creator's true intention after all. Either way, both of these Janes show that it wasn't just her who sold Anne and George down the river, but she nonetheless did so with prudence, knowing how her testimony would look to the Boleyn's enemies. It's funny you never see a depiction that shows her betrayal blowing up in her face and leaving her destitute. Surely enough people have been executed by Henry at this point for her to know what happens to the families of the condemned. But anyway, before I lose my voice, let's talk about Wolf Hall, which is a recent, albeit stagnant, development of Lady Rochford. Like with the rest of the Boleyns, Cromwell's POV lumps her under the same umbrella as ambitious, snide, cruel, and vindictive. But she's too much of a bitch for even the Boleyns to handle. In the first series, which adapted the first two books in the trilogy, She was played by Jessica Raine, and I've already complained about how her performance here is interchangeable with her portrayal of Catherine Parr in Becoming Elizabeth. But I'm only just now noticing the irony in the latter's case. You play a midwife on a TV show for 3 seasons, and then get unceremoniously killed off in another show because of childbirth complications. Granted, I don't hate Jessica Raine, she's a great actress, especially in Call the Midwife, but this was the point in time when I just got really sick of how Jane is portrayed over and over again as a bitch. The Wolf Hall trilogy in general made great strides in showing a lot of characters in a different light, if you'll pardon the pun. Cromwell's not an ambitious dude sadistically dragging down his rivals. He's a guy trying to survive like everyone else. Henry VIII makes himself the definition of narcissism. Maybe Jane Seymour isn't the girl who always cries, but that's what she wants you to believe. So why isn't Jane Rochford given the same treatment? Granted, Cromwell needs agents in all areas of the court, including Anne Boleyn's household, and Jane is the one to fill that gap. She lays the groundwork for most of the accusations which will be brought against George and Anne. Nonetheless, he doesn't put his full trust in her. Her work as a spy continues even into the second Wolf Hall series, The Mirror and the Light. Like many of the supporting characters for the second series, Jane was recast. This time she was played by Leslie Leonard. This seems like a very deliberate decision, as Leonard was in the original stage productions of Wolf Hall, in both West End and Broadway, as Anne Boleyn. Once again, she brings information about the goings-on of the Queen's household to Cromwell. Though in the books between 1537 and 1540, most of her scenes are her badgering him about when they'll get a new queen. I think she plays some off-screen role in getting Henry to notice Catherine Howard, and Cromwell knows that Catherine could threaten his stability, despising Norfolk for using his nieces to gain power.
Have you not seen him looking at my niece? He cast a fantasy to Catherine the first time he ever did see her!
If you want power, why don't you get it like a man, instead of pandering your f***ing nieces?
I guess what annoys me is these 3 Janes, the most recent ones we have, were written by women, and yet I see so much internalised misogyny when it comes to how Jane is written. Granted, there are people, not just women, who can't stand to see others elevated, and being so unremarkable, they prefer to tear others down rather than build themselves up. If you want to push that kind of rhetoric onto Jane, you need more than a few scenes of her glaring and making snide remarks. Previous versions have made her a little more complex where Catherine Howard is concerned, but I feel that in the endeavour to deify Anne Boleyn, who is a flawed human being in her own right, every woman around her has to be demonised. I think the casting requirements for Jane Rochford are must look like a bitch from 100 yards away. The grand majority of her actresses certainly have the look of a bitchy person. Maybe they're just that good at acting. Jane is another one of those Tudor figures who never had a proper portrait made of them in their lifetime. There is this sketch which is often attributed to her, as it is labelled the Lady Parker, and Jane Parker would have likely been the most well-known member of her family, having married the brother of the king's mistress and his pending second wife. The likelihood that she ever sat for one is slim, and many portraits with no official affiliation have been placed to her, including this miniature, which has also been identified as the Lady Mary. Despite her year of birth supposedly being 1505, meaning she would only be 36 or 37 when she was beheaded, there is a diverse range of actresses cast as her, at least in terms of age. For the most part, Jane should range from young to middle-aged, depending on what part of the timeline you're covering. And yet, there has been the decision to cast older women as Jane. This started with Sheila Burrell in The Six Wives, who was 47, followed by Margaret Ward, aged 51, and Kelly Hunter, who was in her late 30s, but she was clearly older than George, even if they never shared a scene. Even the 2021 series is guilty of this, where Anna Brewster is 4 years older than Papa Asiadu, and you can tell. On the one hand, it does peek into the misogynistic and ageist idea that the older a woman gets, the more she envies the beauty and youth of other women, thus scheming against them, in an evil queen sort of way. On the other hand, I think that because Sheila Burrell's performance is the most well-known and most memorable, it has influenced later iterations into casting older actresses. In the case of Six Wives and ITV, they were including Catherine Howard as well, so casting someone older would help with the presentation of the two having a mother-daughter bond. Angela Pleasance needs all the help she can get to look a lot younger, so comparing her with Sheila Burrell, definite win. So rather than recast after covering Anne Boleyn or just putting a little aging makeup on your actress, they seem to have bitten the bullet and gone with an older actress for the entire timeline. The Tudors didn't feel the need to do this, however. The only thing that changed about Lady Rochford's appearance was her hair colour. She came in as a blonde, only to become brunette by the end of season 3. My guess is Joanne King had other roles going on that required her to dye her hair. Isn't it strange that of all these Janes, only 1 or 2 have come off in any way justified for their actions? I'm not saying I want a completely unrecognisable Jane from her previous counterparts, but a Jane with depth would be more ideal than one who just always hated her husband and let him and Anne be executed because she was jealous. What if in future she is instead blackmailed by Cromwell into providing false witness, or otherwise compelled? Or she said something out of context that he twists and she can't take back. I'm just tired of seeing the same thing again and again. Jane Parker's entire legacy has been completely warped thanks to the testimony of men who wrote about her decades after her execution. Historians and dramatists almost always pull from those sources and they think, yes, woman devious, woman malicious, let not dig no further, more boobs. Granted, I'm not sure the women writers are thinking that, but I would love for Jane to be given a better portrayal. Even if she does end up betraying George in the end, give her a better reason for doing so, instead of him being a wanker who assaulted her on their wedding night. That was a cheap shortcut and you know it. And then there's the Catherine Howard situation. I guess all this depends on if you show both beheaded queens. Say Jane was compelled to betray her sister-in-law, and she's made to feel a hell of a lot of guilt as a result. Why would she then feel compelled to protect Catherine? In both the depictions we saw, it's because she has some form of connection to one or the other, that being Catherine or Culpeper. Jane has been at the Tudor court long enough that she may think she knows how to avoid getting caught, and that there are factors that she overlooked. If Jane had indeed come to care for Catherine, she may have decided it was worth the risk. I believe that whatever bout of madness that came upon her once the accusations were laid bare was genuine. She had seen almost everyone close to her executed by now, and knew that even being a woman wouldn't mean you'd get a nice quick death. The previous victim on Tower Green had been Margaret Pole, whose beheading took multiple strokes. But I'm totally willing to believe that Henry was willing to call her bluff over her mental state. His pride was too bruised to let anyone slip through the net. And that was my very exhaustive Lady Rochford video. It's been a longer journey than I thought, and I exceeded my word limit for many of these sections, and oh my god, the editing took forever. But honestly, it had to be done. Maybe now I've gone all out on the continued flawed decision to dismiss Jane Parker as a scheming, backstabbing bitch whose karma found her in the end. Things might change. Or we get more future disappointments that will drive more people to this video, and we can all complain about it together. Won't that be fun? But yeah, vilification of Jane Parker has gone on long enough. The excuses range from scapegoating her, rather than blaming Henry or Cromwell, or deifying Anne Boleyn and making her so much of a not like other girls, that it condemns the entirety of the female gender to uphold a few. Exactly how is that progressive? Because at the end of the day, Henry was the one to blame. Henry was the one who wanted rid of Anne by any means necessary. Henry was the one who thought a teenage girl would see him as anything other than a king who could uplift her and her family. It was Henry VIII all along? Always has been. Right, rather than set everything up again, I will just do the outro right now. So yeah, I had to re-record that last segment, otherwise this video probably would have been done a day sooner, but it's been a long month. Seriously, how are we only reaching the end of January now? I feel like an entire year's gone by. Think at the start of this month, I was still working on Panto. That feels ages away now. But regardless, we've come to the end of this video and it's time to talk about what's coming next, because we finally hit 8,000 subscribers. So it's time to talk about the Wolf Hall trilogy in its entirety. So for the 8K special, because of a request from one of my patrons, I decided we're going to cover Wolf Hall in general. Apart from the stage shows, which I haven't been able to watch because there aren't any pro shots. But I have read all 3 books and I've seen both of the TV series, so we'll talk about those 2. I'm aware that everyone in America still has to wait another 6 weeks for Mirror and the Light to come out. I don't know why you have to wait so long. I've already seen the second series in its entirety, so I will be talking about that. Spoiler alert. And of course, in the last video, oh god, yes. Yeah, quickie update on something that was really annoyingly happening yesterday. So in my sleep-deprived state, I accidentally deleted the George Boleyn video, but it's been re-uploaded as of last night. Yeah, I feel a bit foolish. Basically, what's been happening with the editing process of this Jane Parker video, I've been uploading it in segments to make sure that YouTube's okay with it, and accidentally included George Boleyn in that, and he got deleted, so I put that back. But anyway, yes, I mentioned at the end of the George Boleyn video that I put a poll on Patreon to decide the next subject, and this one was quite tense. I was coming back to it every couple days to see how it was going, and usually when it comes to these polls I tend to reuse old candidates to see if they'll get a chance this time. And of the 4 decisions, there was Mary Margaret Tudor, Wuthering Heights, Henry VII and Edward VI, and I honestly thought Edward VI was going to win this one. There is a tiebreaker between the other 3, so I had to put in a tie-breaking vote, and the next project will be Henry VII, because that one I can do with ease. Wuthering Heights and Mary Margaret Tudor were tied for 2nd place, so why don't I cover those as well? So yeah, this video is finished. Let's thank the patrons and move on to our new projects. I'm listing my patrons here. If you want to become a patron, you can sign up. There are different tiers for different levels of support you want to contribute, but no matter which tier you sign up to, you will get your name in the credits, as well as access to my Discord server, where you'll get more immediate updates as to how I'm doing. And also, I'm going to London soon for like just a day, but I'm going to the Tower of London, so you'll get to see my pictures of the Tower of London if you sign up and join the Discord. And if you're a top tier contributor, thank you Alison Cuff, Anna from Gustine, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams. So yeah, next up, Henry VII and Wolf Hall, and also a small video about locations in which they filmed certain period pieces. That'll be a very short video. A lot is happening in February.